I usually start off these talks by saying when the man was born. I remember the birth date, and I think as long as I've remembered that, then I'm going to remember everything else that I'm going to say, but I can't do that today. Unfortunately, Charles John Bateman, his birth wasn't registered. And he gave several different birth dates. I suspect if you asked him how old he was, he'd only vary his answer depending on what he thought he might get out of it. So he was born sometime between September of 1874 and February of 1876. Now, his dad was a cabbie and a musician, and his mum was a parlourmaid. So Charles and Annie, they'd married in Aldersgate a few years before Charles John was born. He had an older brother and an older sister, and they were living in Clerkenwell at the time that John was born. Unfortunately, his father died very young. He died in his mid-30s when John was just 5 years old, and it meant that his mother was forced to work to keep a roof over her young family's heads. Unfortunately, she was a bit of an angry drunk and had taken to drinking, probably following her husband's death. They got into all sorts of scrapes with her landlady, and eventually burst into the poor woman's bathroom one day when she was washing and started attacking her. She ended up going to jail for a month, serving time with hard labour, and the children ended up in the workhouse. John and his older brother Benjamin ended up going to a workhouse school somewhere in Islington, and they were probably musicians like their father before them in the workhouse school band. Now, they wore sort of quasi-military style uniforms. They were very visible, much like the band that we used to have down at Beach Home, Banstead Cottage Homes. They'd go around all the local fetes and they'd play music, usually to a very high standard, to entertain people there. And they're a vital fundraising tool for these workhouse schools. And so they'd play at dinners where wealthy philanthropists would be, and they'd obviously donate towards the running of the school. Now, the chief benefit to the boys, rather than the school, was that it was a route into the army, regular, steady employment. You couldn't normally join the army until you were 18 years old, but if you're a bandsman or a musician, you could join at 14 years old. And John's older brother Benjamin joined the West Riding Regiment, and just a couple of years later, John joined up too. Now, he was only about 4'9" at the time, weighing less than 6 stone, tiny child, and he was gave his age as 14 years and 3 months, although he may have added a little bit on to make himself appear a little bit older. He served in the 1st Battalion, his brother had gone in the 2nd Battalion, and so they didn't meet up for some years afterwards. John was in a barracks in Witton, near Twickenham, for a couple of years before he went off overseas, and he ended up in South Africa at the same time as his brother in the mid-1890s. Now, at the time, tensions were starting to build up in South Africa. They discovered gold on the Witwatersrand a few years earlier, and what had happened was this agricultural Boer republic that suddenly got this massive influx of British people primarily and people from all over our empire flooding in there to mine gold, to work in the gold mines there and the diamond mines. And this created a lot of tension there because these incomers didn't have the vote, so a lot of people felt they were being dictated to by the minority government that were there at the time. And Cecil Rhodes saw an opportunity to exploit this, get in there, foment a revolt which would enable him to send an expedition in to annex the colony, the Boer Republic, as a British colony and take the gold mines. So he conceived this expedition, which was to be led by a chap called Leander Starr Jameson. You might remember it as known as the Jameson Raid, very famous one. And it happened just a few months after John arrived in the country. About 600 armed men rode hard into the Boer Republic, heading for Johannesburg, expecting the country and the city to rise in support, but they didn't. Boer commandos harassed them all the way. They never got within further than 2 miles from Johannesburg, and the Uitlanders, as the British settlers, the Outlanders, foreigners, the British settlers were called, never rose in support. And so Jameson and his men were forced to surrender and ended up going to jail. Highly embarrassing for the British government. Cecil Rhodes seems to have got away with it. There was some suggestion, or quite a lot of controversy, over how complicit the British government were. There were certainly people like Joseph Chamberlain who knew that this was going to happen. So it was quite a dangerous situation. It looked like we might end up going to war. At the same time as that, there was a Matabele uprising in Rhodesia, and so the West Ridings had to go and fight there as well. So there were all kinds of things going on when the two boys were there. And those tensions would eventually result in the Second Anglo-Boer War in 1899. Shortly before that happened, John moved off elsewhere, and he went out to the East Indies, Burma or Myanmar, and he was stationed out there for a number of years. He was a bandsman. He had graduated from a boy soldier to a private soldier when he turned 18. He'd been promoted up to Lance Corporal, as almost all Lance Corporals did. He lost his stripe very soon afterwards, regained it again. So he would have been in charge of a small section of a squad of 4 to 8 men, perhaps. The bandsmen all had different duties depending on which regiment they were part of, and they probably acted as stretcher bearers and medics in times of conflict. But the West Ridings sailed to South Africa to take part in the fighting there. But they left John behind, and he stayed in Burma for another couple of years. It was very near the end of his time in the army. He'd already done 12 years, including his time as a boy by then. So he had another couple of years to make 12 years as an adult before he would be discharged from the army. He stayed in Burma and eventually returned home to Britain in 1902. He left the army. He tried to make a living as a musician for a few years, and he was living and working up in Greenwich when he met a girl 10 years his junior called Alice Downs. And they moved in together in Greenwich. They got married at Christchurch, and then they settled down to have a family of their own. They had a son, Charles. They moved near here to Warlingham as well, probably coinciding with a change of job. With a young family to support, he'd need something more stable than a musician's income. So he might have been working at one of the asylums that was over that way. But he came here very soon afterwards to work at our local asylum at Banstead. Now, they employed an awful lot of ex-military men. It was very common to see these men come straight out of the army and go straight into service with them. They had great big accommodation blocks, which they had about 200 staff living in, a number of cottages as well. But John and Alice didn't live in one of those married cottages. They actually took a house on Downs Road in Laboratory Cottages in Belmont. I don't unfortunately know where those are. Before moving around the corner to number 13, Clifton Avenue. And that's where they had their second and third children. Now, Alice was pregnant with the third child when war broke out, so John didn't immediately join the army as many of his colleagues did. And he waited until after the birth of their daughter, Maisie, before he joined up. Now, he'd grown a bit. He wasn't 4'9¼ anymore. He was now 5'5¼ and he was weighing something like 9 stones, so he was still quite a small man at that time. He joined up in May of 1915. He chose to serve with the Royal Army Medical Corps, perhaps showing his all those years of training as a male nurse working at the asylum, and perhaps as a stretcher bearer in the army before that. Now, he trained throughout the summer of 1915 and joined the 31st Casualty Clearing Station when they were mobilised in September of that year. Now, they sailed for France towards the end of the month, but they weren't actually destined to fight on the Western Front. They went down to the south of France, and after a few weeks waiting around there, they eventually shipped out of Marseille at the end of October and went across the Mediterranean to Egypt. They went to Camp Sidi el-Bashir in the middle of the desert, somewhere near Cairo. They unloaded all their equipment, and a few weeks later they were still waiting there with their equipment piled up by the sidings, wondering what on earth was going on, before they were put back on a ship and sailed off elsewhere. Now, their destination was Greece, northern Greece, the port of Thessaloniki, we call it nowadays, but they would have called it Salonika. The Balkans had been recovering from a couple of really bad wars. The first of those in 1912, when the Balkan countries had united to fight against the Ottoman Empire, and then once having won that, they fell out with each other over the territory that they'd captured and started a second Balkan War, which had just come to a conclusion in 1913. The political fallout from that led almost directly to the start of the Great War, with the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo. Now, despite being one of the key belligerents very early in the war, Serbia had come through relatively unscathed for quite a long time. It had held off the attacks by the Austro-Hungarians, and it was sitting fairly pretty. It had some allies within the other Balkan countries. A lot of them were remaining neutral, waiting to see which way the wind was going to blow. And so we would make promises to people like the Bulgarians of what they might gain from coming on our side. And we'd also perhaps threaten them, talk about what they might be losing when the Germans come in, and putting restrictions on their shipping, all those sorts of things like that. Both sides were doing that, trying to get these neutral countries to come in, and over the time they gradually did. And you have people like Italy coming into the war in 1915. And then Bulgaria came in September of 1915. But they came in on the side of the Central Powers, Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire. And what this did was it was to secure the eastern flank of the country of Serbia, effectively, so now the Germans and the Austro-Hungarians could invade with impunity because they knew that they were not going to be attacked from the left as they went down through the country. The Serbians could not hold back the Germans, and they retreated back through their country. And as they retreated, the Bulgarians started to attack from the east as well. They couldn't withstand this pincer movement, and they withdrew west to the Adriatic. Now, the British and the French, who were Serbia's allies, sent an expeditionary force to go and to try and stop the Germans there. The trouble is they didn't have anywhere to land. They had no beachhead, really, no good beachhead. Now, we previously invaded Greece were neutral, and we previously invaded a couple of their islands to give us a stepping stone to Gallipoli, so there was the possibility we could just invade their mainland as well. But what we waited for was an invitation to land. So while they remained officially neutral, their Prime Minister, Eleftherios Venizelos, who was pro-Allied, invited us to land at the port city of Salonika in direct contravention with the wishes of King Constantine and many members of the Greek government. That tension would result in a civil war in Greece that eventually would bring them into the war on our side. So we landed these men at Salonika, and they marched north. But they were too late, really, and they had to turn around and retreat and come back. Now, it was just after they had started marching north to try and stop this German invasion of Serbia that John and his casualty clearing station was sent to Salonika, and they set up just outside the port city itself. Now, a casualty clearing station exists to receive the wounded men that have been passed down several stages already of the evacuation chain, and they would be miles and miles behind the front line. And here they have the option of treating men if they were going to get better within a week or so. They'd be treated at this clearing station. And if they weren't, they'd be shipped off on a train to a hospital. Now, it's a very unusual setup where they were. They were right by the port. In fact, they were further from the front line than the hospitals they were going to be sending the wounded back to were. It was a very awkward arrangement. So as another casualty clearing station was retreating, stopping off at stations every now and then to establish these rendezvous points to ferry men back to the coast. Those trains would then come down the coast of Salonika to the station. They'd be picked up by men from John's casualty clearing station. They'd be taken back to their base and then assessed as to whether they were an urgent case and needed to go to hospital, whether they could be treated there. So they had a collection of marquees, very big marquees, and if they, which were wards and operating theatres, and if they were in any one place for any length of time, they would build huts. So they stayed in position there for quite some time. We encamped ourselves within the port of Salonika. We dug lines of fortifications around it called the bird cage because we wired ourselves in there as a beachhead for some future offensive. We weren't in position to do that just yet. As the Greek political situation deteriorated and it looked like they might come in on the side of the Central Powers, we pushed out from that port city. So the British, the French, the Serbs, the Russians and the Italians, all the international contingent of allies that were in there, pushed out several miles from the port to start holding this front line, which is very near the border between Greece and Serbia. Bulgaria invaded in the north of the country in the summer of 1916, and then the fighting really started, particularly around Lake Tuaran, which is on the Serbian border, about 30 miles north of Salonika. And John and his casualty clearing station was sent over to that locale. They were about 10 miles from the front line. So in front of them, 10 miles away, the Bulgarians had the high ground in mountains around Lake Tuaran, and then behind them we'd have the British lines. Behind the front line would be a regimental first aid post. Then 1,000 yards along the communications trench would be an advanced dressing station, and then about 1.5 miles, 2 miles back from that would be a main dressing station. And so the men would be carried along that particular chain. They'd walk if they could. They'd be carried on stretchers to the first stop. Then from there they'd be dragged on travois, pulled behind mules or on litters mounted on mules, or wheeled stretchers pulled by horses and mules along these narrow, twisting, winding roads that we couldn't really get lorries up, and we didn't have the lorries to get up there if we had anyway. And they would be brought back to these main dressing stations. We'd be on a road, and then an ambulance would pick them up from these main dressing stations and drive them to a station, and they'd be put on a train, and then they go to a hospital, or more likely to a casualty clearing station. Now, 31st Casualty Clearing Station, Jonathan, were at the town of Yanez, which is now called Metalico. It's known by about 5 different names because that area is claimed by Bulgaria and Macedonia and Greece, and the Austrians were the first to survey it with military maps and things. So there's all these different kinds of names, which means that if you look at a modern Greek map, they bear absolutely no relation at all to the names that are used in the official histories of the war. And they were based on this town of Yanez, this railway junction there. Now, they'd be receiving typically something like 300 men coming in each week. Now, the extremes of climate there, very hot in the summer, very cold in the winter, absolutely no shelter at all, meant that the biggest problems were things like exposure and sunstroke and disease. A lot of standing water and hot weather means that we get a lot of mosquitoes. And malaria was the really big killer there. And you see that a very high proportion of the number of men coming in are malarial cases. Now, the proportion of sick to wounded is something like 9 to 1. A very unhealthy place to be, except when there's a major battle raging. At that point, you'd see the intake of men coming in to be something like 1,000 men coming in every week to be treated. Now, John wouldn't have seen the fighting, but he would have come into contact with the Germans, because we had virtually no fighter planes in Salonika at that time. And so there were an awful lot of air raids going on. And they come and they bomb the camps. It didn't matter if there was a Red Cross on the roof. The camp would be bombed anyway. And so very often these German planes would come over, drop bombs mostly by hand. And they had quite a number of near misses, and a lot of tents and equipment destroyed. You couldn't, in such a cold climate, if the tent was full of holes, you couldn't reasonably expect men to be sleeping in there. So it wouldn't take much damage to put one of these casualty clearing station wards out of action for a while. They had dugouts and air raid shelters that they could go to, and they did. And as the air raid siren went off, they'd pick up all the men that could be moved, and they'd move them into these air raid shelter dugouts. And those that they couldn't, they'd put them on the floor between their beds, so that at least they'd have some kind of protection from shrapnel flying all about. There were mostly male nurses there, but there were some women starting to arrive in 1917, and it was noted especially how calm and collected that they were during air raids. They were thought that they were going to be all flighty and panicky, but no, they were made of much sterner stuff than that. We eventually got air superiority. Those air raids started to go, and we would launch an offensive that would eventually push the Bulgarians back out of the country. There was a long time where the main killer was disease. Malaria mostly, but a complication of malaria started to come in the winter 100 years ago, which is called blackwater fever. Now, this is where red blood cells start to burst as a result of the malarial infection. And you end up passing red or black urine, which is where it gets its name from. It can be very deadly. And it was probably with this that John fell ill in early March. He was evacuated to a hospital to be treated, but unfortunately he died 100 years ago today, probably aged 43, leaving a widow and 3 young children.
Let us pray. Father of all, remember your promise and look with love on all your people, living and departed. On this day, we especially remember Charles John Bateman and ask that we would hold forever him and all those who suffered during the First World War, those who returned scarred by warfare, those who waited anxiously at home, and those who returned wounded and disillusioned, those who mourned, and those communities that were diminished and suffered loss. Remember too those who acted with kindly compassion, those who bravely risked their own lives for their comrades, and those who in the aftermath of war worked tirelessly for a more peaceful world. And as you remember them, remember us. O Lord, grant us peace peace in our time and a longing for the day when people of every language, race and nation will be brought into the unity of Christ's kingdom. This we ask in the name of the same Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. As our Saviour taught us, so we pray. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, the power and glory, forever and ever. Amen. Would you please stand?
When you go home, tell them of us and say, for your tomorrow we gave our today.
God grant to the living grace, the departed rest, the Church, the Queen, the Commonwealth, and all the world peace and concord. And to us and all God's servants life everlasting. And may the blessing of God Almighty, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit be among you and remain with